I'm glad you made it back. In this video, we will taking a look at the file manager. We will take a look at the file manager and see the difference between cache versus our documents. And we will also take a look how we can access a file path on disk and be able to save and read from disk. With our entry conforming to the protocol Codable, we can now create our entry storage controller. And our entry storage controller will be in charge of saving our entry as JSON to disk on our iOS device, and also fetching from disk these entries from the JSON that we created. So inside of our entry storage controller, we will create this directory URL, and we will access the default file manager for our iOS device, and we will look for a URL of the document directory, and there's also directory for temporary files that will get deleted if device starts running out of memory, but we want it to persist between application launches no matter what happens. So we will save it to the document directory in our user domain mask, and that's just inside of our sandbox for our app. And we will get the first URL that matches that. And then we will create the save method, and we will make sure that a URL exists at this directory URL. And we also want to append a path component called entries.json, because that's what we want to save our entries into, is this entries.json file. And we just want to say that this is not a directory, so we're set false for that. And if this fails, we want to crash the app with this fatal error. And we want to crash the app because if we can't save to this entries.json, then there's something really wrong with the structure of our app, so we can force that crash. And we created this encoder, which is a JSON encoder, because we want to save this as JSON. And then we're doing this do try catch block, and we're saying that the data is going to be equal to this encoder.encode, and we are going to encode the entries. And then we are going to check our file manager, and we are going to see if the file already exists. If the file does exist, we want to remove that file and recreate it. So we do file manager.default.create file. We're going to create this file at a certain path, and that's going to be the url.path, and that URL is the URL that we created in this method. And the attributes will be nil, and the contents we will use data, and that's the data that we created just above in this do try catch block. And if an error is presented to us, we will crash the app and just print the error to the console. And again, only error that will happen is if there's something in our app that's going completely wrong to where the file system is not working correctly. So now let's go ahead and create this fetch entries method, and this will return to us our entries, or an array of entry from this entries.json file that should now exist on disk. And if it doesn't exist on disk, we just want to present an empty array. So first let's get the URL, which is the same as above, where we get the entries.json, which is not a directory. Again, if we cannot get this file, we will crash the app with this fatal error. And then we can say if file manager.default file exists with this exclamation point at the beginning, which means it does not exist. We just want to return an empty array. If the file does exist, we want to get the data from the file manager. So we'll do file manager.default.contents at path, which will be the URL path that we created. And then we want to grab this decoder, which will be a JSON decoder, which will know how to parse the JSON and give us an entry from it. So we can do this do try catch block again, and we can say let entries equals try decoder.decode. And we want to decode our entry type, but we want to get an array of this entry, so we'll put it in the square brackets and call self on it. And then we want to get the entries from the data that we are passing in, and then we want to return those entries. If there's an error in any of this, we can just return an empty array, and that will just fill our table view data source with nothing instead of the entries. But if there's something completely wrong with the file system, then we want to crash our application because there's something wrong with the path in the URL that we created. In the next video, we will take our journaling app and fetch and save our entries using the file manager that we just created.